My name is Dirk Zeller. I'm Professor of Marine Conservation at the School of Biological Sciences and the Director of the Sea Wilderness Ocean, also a member of the Ocean. My apology, I'd like to send apologies from Christoph, who can't be here today. I think he's traveling. So he fly to somewhere beautiful. That is in Bali. I don't know anyway. So I'm stepping in as an introduction. And the Ocean Institute. So I think we can go to the slide. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the Chipmunga people, who are the traditional owners of the land on which we live today. Pay our respects, elders, past and present. Now I would like to introduce Professor Christopher Golden from Harvard School, DHN School of Public Health. Really happy. I've known Chris for quite a while, for quite a few years. He's definitely much younger than I am. Chris is a professor of nutrition and planetary health. Just get the background. I'm hosting him for a week. Yeah, besides the engagement, also running with his postdocs. Running a workshop on Thursday at the Forrest Research Foundation on in part what we talk about to us today. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Chris.
Good afternoon, everyone. Really nice to meet you all. As Dirk mentioned, Associate Professor of Nutrition and Planetary Health. My background is in ecology and epidemiology, and much of my field work is rooted in a long-term experience where I've been living in Madagascar the last 25 years. So much of the way that I think about these topics is really based in an embedded kind of local immersion experience. People in the audience have heard of the term planetary health better than any audience that I ever got in purpose. So planetary health is an approach to understanding the human health impacts of environmental change, whether we are thinking about fisheries declines, the risk of fuel and firewood, the conversion of forest to agricultural fields, climate change, urbanization. Each one of these environmental transformations will have some sort of impact on not only biodiversity, but also on human health. And so I see it as my job to understand how we can try and characterize these relationships between environmental change and human health, particularly as they relate to food systems. So an underlying current in a lot of my work is to understand the importance of animal source foods. So animal source foods are something that are not important across the world, but are particularly important in the global south. Much of my work is really so in places like Australia or states or other places, there are many ethical and moral dimensions to animal source food consumption. Places like Madagascar, where I work, it's far more critical to get access to these foods for nutritional purposes because they are a critical supply of micronutrients, fatty acids, vitamins that you really can't get otherwise in the diet. And so in the context of a lack of both biofortified foods, fortified food, increased infectious disease burden that leaches micronutrient vitamins away from the body. All of these things spell a greater demand for these types of nutrients that need to be found somewhere. And so because of the kind of lack of access to healthcare, lack of access to vitamins and supplements, and often diverse diets, people really rely on animal source foods for these key nutrients in many contexts. And so just to underlie this, of animal source foods, small-scale fisheries and fisheries they play a really important role in contributing those nutrients to different elements of society. So you can see here, all these countries in red, small-scale fisheries are contributing an enormous amount of overall nutrient supply to a variety of different countries. You can see the concentration all along the equatorial in the global south, and then even as percentages of overall animal source food. You can see that there are key countries that kind of pop out. Those are the locations that my team and I tend to focus on in terms of. So I'm going to take you through a very basic chain of events. some type of environmental change, in this case, fisheries decline, how that leads to a change in the food, reduce access to seafood, how that then changes nutrient intake, leading to decreases in vitamin and micronutrient intake decreasing. And then finally, what sort of health impacts derived from those reduced intakes? And depending on the social, economic, and cultural context, that could either lead you into micronutrient deficiencies or into the acceleration of what is called the nutrition transition. So that's really where you are substituting foods that are traditionally healthy and mixing them with a lot of processed foods, ultra-processed foods, refined sugars, high energy, then energy dense foods that then lead to things like metabolic disease. So really understanding the role of fish in this dynamic food system and across space and time. So I didn't have time to get into any of my terrestrial work, and the Oceans Institute was hosting this, and so I'm not going to speak about it at all, other than to say my work started by understanding the role of bushmeat, terrestrial wildlife in human nutrition and diet. And then I began seeing headlines like these: the world running out of fish, death of coral reefs, global warming could sink billions. And it got me thinking to what extent what I was studying in this remote corner of Madagascar was really a microcosm of a much broader story. A story that was demonstrating a reliance still on wild source foods, but on one that had come to be domesticated in some cases, in the case of aquaculture, but also quite pervasive across the world in really serving this critical nutrient supply for vulnerable populations around the world. And so what I'm going to walk you through is how declining fish catch is leading to alternative foods, how those alternative foods are then causing dietary changes, positioning some elements of society into nutritionability, and then what can we do about that? What are the kind of technological ecosystem-based solutions to try to correct some of the pathways that our society is going? Keep trying to and so on. So to start with declining fish catch, you see here, this is a examination of the degree to which sea temperature rise will lead to decreases in fish catch over time. So here's the most recent projection from the IPCC report. And as you can see, it's these same areas that are kind of this equatorial area where you have reductions of upwards of 50% decline in fish catch by 21. And so to most biologists and ecologists in the room, they're thinking of this from a very ecological biodiversity and fish biomass perspective. When I look at this as a public health specialist, I see that the countries whose oceans are in red are the same countries who are affected by food insecurity, green governance issues, lack of adaptation to climate change, and a variety of other social and cultural factors that might disproportionately position them to be really threatened by a loss of access to seafood. It almost spells this looming food crisis, what might happen in the future given reductions in access to seafood. And so what sorts of alternative foods will people move into? So with many colleagues of mine within my lab and beyond, I published a paper called Aquatic Foods to Nourish Nations, and one of the primary products of this, which Jessica and Laura will be presenting in a Thursday workshop, is something called the Aquatic Food Composition Database. We have nearly 3,000 taxa of aquatic food species with all of their nutrient composition details, so that we can understand how they rank in comparison to a variety of other foods. So if you look here, what you're seeing is on the vertical axis, this is ranked from best across a variety of different nutrients and vitamins. And so across the board, the top 7 animal source foods that are the most nutritious are all blue foods or aquatic foods. So these are things like small pelagic fish, bivalves, large pelagics. I realize that aquatic mammals is somewhat sensitive, but because there is a cultural attachment and need for this in many First Nation and Aboriginal communities, we still list this as, of course, a viable food source. Salmons, carps, cephalopods, etc. And so this to me is so interesting because when you look at the climate and environmental footprints of some of these food sources, aquatic foods tend to rise to the top as well as being less environmentally friendly, things like beef, lamb, etc. So is there some sort of win-win here that's paving the way toward a sustainable future if we can get aquatic food production done right? I guess the base message there, though, is regardless of food type, if people are losing access to seafood, almost by definition, they're moving into something that is nutritionally. So it's not to say that you can't compensate for that by having dietary diversity, and particularly in wealthier societies, there's you can be a healthy vegetarian, you can be a healthy vegan. But in many contexts around the world, having access to seafood is detrimental. So what sorts of dietary changes might arise? I propose that there's three different typologies, and this is of course going to gloss over a lot of complexity and nuance within these three broader typologies. But we'll see the unaffected multiplication. Think about collapse of fish stocks in places like the United States, South Korea, New Zealand, and for all intents and purposes, there might be some small shifts in price, there might be some small shifts in which species are being produced and consumed, but the market might kind of equilibrate a lot of those dynamics, and the people who are eating seafood will continue to do so, and the people who are not eating seafood will continue. You then have the case of increasing undernutrition. These are places like Madagascar, Gabon, Suriname, Namibia, where a crash of local fish stocks, this could be from bleaching or from industrial fishing fleets, distant water fleets that come in and all their entire ecosystem and destroy the small scale fisheries for them. This would lead to them being forced into kind of cheaply replaceable alternatives, not substitutes. So things like white rice, more tubers, more veg. But as an example, in Madagascar, when we priced out what it would cost for people to purchase domesticated meats to compensate from lost fish or lost bushmeat, hire roughly 50 to 90% of their annual liquid income to compensate what they were freely able to access by these wild foods. So none of us, no matter how big your salary is, would ever be able to afford purchasing that amount of meat with that portion of our salary. So this means that they're going to be going into nutrient poor foods and not have access to those nutrients. We then have this third typology, the acceleration of the nutrition transition. So this is something that's really, really interesting. You can think of countries like Mexico, Brazil, Philippines, Indonesia, a small island developing nation in the Pacific, where a collapse of their local fisheries would lead to fast food and more white rice, more turkey tails, more mutton flaps, more fast foods, more frozen pizza, chicken fingers, etc., leading to a greater risk of metabolic disease, variety of diseases of affluence. So it kind of positions fish in this really interesting matrix of deciding the futures of food systems in many ways. I don't want to emphasize them. You see it as a really critical foundation of many food systems in different. So where do we see nutritional vulnerability arise? Thinking about that second typology only, where we have countries who are both reliant on fish and at a threshold for micronutrient deficiency. Then we overlay that with the dark blue, which are the areas that are expected to lose access to the most seafood and fish catch because of increasing sea temperature rise over time. Where those two colors mix are the countries that we expect to be hardest hit by the human health impacts of climate change when it comes to fisheries collapse. I realize that as a non-marine scientist, I'm using the word fisheries collapse technical way to think of this as reductions in fish catch and reduced access to seafood. But those are the areas that we would worry about the most. And so what can we do about it? There are different sorts of interventions, whether it is an increase in aquaculture production to kind of balance out what we're missing in terms of increased or reduced seafood production, or kind of better, more efficient fisheries management. So I'm going to show a brief film right now. Take a quick break, much as it's supposed to help you kind of dive into what this might look like.
Lista de comissões. Datang kita David slow. Dahil kita nagbubuhat ko manulong food supply. Isang niyan, kita sa Simarlo.
Speaking less after Yoga, armas naris los jiu naris ka kubuan na kunci kane plagin ini ano we ko itong party kita kita kunci itu es mangarate mami program se makarate untuk nantian secara selalu ada simulasi di apa yang ada Iwan J. Tongan Basindok, Abu J. Niara Kotorka, ini Guadeu, Niasa Po, sampai ketemu Yusuf, ini ansis ni ipung dengan panisi pun dan mas, yang cuma dia lakukan kecil, rap nibat tim lakukan nau, termasuk sekarang dia itu, Indra. Orang sis ni kau kalau juga korek dia pun sudah masuk itu deh ada.
Kalau jadi sekarang fungsional yang dari dalam basis bahasa Indonesia, anak penjualan itu yang mutiara, sebagai pengajar kami kontrol itu, pengelolaan dan dari ada sekolah nasional sekolah controlling
Reservoir ni sebenarnya boleh. Saya boleh.
Si Wangalo bisa nalo magpagalo ang makiyan. Kaya sa kapo magkakas sa biwa sa langit imingalo. Pero si polisi sila ang kahit po bisa sila stop na botsen po yang yayasan ada yayasan
Quindi con soldi non fa guida in bene insieme a loro. Que é o básico, esse resumo tem na sua senhora, na outra sua patentar buscar da massa, e na outra sua patentar no todo isso
o dalam subarang dewi maduturan masih na bijabet lerak itu wak.
Pero dapat din ka sana hatin ng pagsiloki, katong bisa granman.
Apa dokumen diki kunci makunci lelo mabit membibile pak. Ora ci silo madiki ci lelo bil sentiu ci sahan. Dele ci sahan jadi That's the way should do sa kaya kolego. At sika dano kung sa kaya pinag-isa namin. Hindi ka sika po kung paano ba kung sika. Hindi naman din lahat kasi malakay. At sinjan lumasibo sa this world. Ika naman dyan. Ilok ng kasalaman silo ang ulit. Exactly. Grazie mio per le anni di cioè mi si adeu le esatti che vengono le caro e c'è che la potete e qua rai perché le già sembra che gari con il lo le caro.
Yeah, so forgetting the Latin college of quality and some of that is a student, a movie that was made by students in Madagascar. But I think it does help to transport you and understand the context by which understand the cultural systems and the way that they perceive how different changes, whether it's with regard to management or taboos or cultural systems or a variety of other factors that can lead to changes in the populations, and how there really needs to be holistic approaches to understanding how to do ecosystem management at these local levels. This paper is in review, so please don't take photos of this. But in thinking about these kind of marine protected areas and locally managed marine areas and how this could actually serve as a public health intervention, can we create systems of conservation that create co-beneficial solutions between conservation and public health? I think marine protected areas are a prime example. And so what we're showing here is that if we were to develop a system in some fake counterfactual world where we protected all of the coral reefs that were currently unprotected, and then estimated the predicted change in catch based on a change in biomass that was attributed to these new protection regimes, we can then calculate a per capita seafood increase per individual living near shorelines of these new marine protected areas, balance that based on their levels of inadequate intake of key nutrients, and then look at what percent increases there could be in their nutrient intake for key nutrients across the board. So I realize that might sound a bit confusing, but if you focus on this purple, the countries that are more purple are the ones that would better benefit from marine protected areas being implemented in their waters, because they both have the nutritional need, the nutritional demand, and levels of biomass that could tremendously benefit from the implementation of marine protected areas. And if we look at numbers of people rather than just percentages of nutrient intake, although those numbers seem quite small, that's kind of how the entire field of public health is built. These very, very, very minor incremental changes that then, when you apply them to the entire population, have massively large benefits. And so you can see by nutrient how many people can benefit in different parts of the world. What I'm going to move us into now is kind of more a theoretical piece of how different countries might be able to benefit through this kind of more ecosystem-based approach. And so in focusing on coral reef systems, as coral reefs move from healthy to degraded systems, and that can be driven by a variety of different pressures or drivers, thinking of climate change, fishing pressure, land use changes, disease outbreaks, among many, many others. And then understanding how this connects to their overall food system dynamics. It kind of needs to go through a variety of different processes and mediating factors. And so you need to understand the governance system of the fisheries in terms of who has access to it, what sort of regulations are involved, and then also the market dynamics. Is fish sold or kept? If it's sold, do people then have money to purchase different items in a market? So is it a traditional economy? Is it more of a Western catch-based economy? And then how does that then translate into different pathways of nutrition? So again, we develop this kind of pathways and systems of typologies where we broke up 4 different diets: a traditional diet with high fish and low Western foods, a mixed diet with high fish and high Western foods, an undernourishing diet with low fish and low Western foods, and an overnourishing diet with low fish and high Western foods. And the idea would be that if there was a healthy coral reef and a traditional economy, that people could have a traditional diet. However, if the coral reef degraded and that coral reef was no longer able to support a meaningful amount of fish as seafood for local communities, then depending on whether they had a traditional economy that would then provide these kind of cheap alternatives of ultra-processed and other craft foods, they would then potentially move into an overnourishing diet with low fish and high Western. Or if they were in a traditional economy and they didn't have access to those foods, they would move into an undernourishing diet with low fish and low Western. This kind of mixed category is where it doesn't fall perfectly into place, and it really depends on certain country-specific factors to kind of push them into one of these other three. Yes. And so when we tried to map this out with existing data, of course, this is very, very fuzzy science. So just to give you an idea how this might look, we thought of reef catch per capita as a reflection of two factors. One was the quality of the ecosystem, and two, the quality of the governance mechanism that allowed people access to fishing. And so if you think of those two things and the intersection of the two, that essentially gets you to reef catch. And then also the import dependency ratio of food-specific imports. And so here in the undernourishing diet, we can see highly degraded coral reefs, very, very low food imports. And then you can see Madagascar following here with very, very low rates of cardiovascular disease. You can then see examples of places like Kiribati, where reef catch is quite high. Import is kind of low, but getting to be higher. And you can kind of see that this transition is happening where people are moving into unhealthier and unhealthier diets and moving them more and more towards this kind of overnourishing diet. And then if you think of places like Barbados in the Caribbean, high import dependency, low reef catch if the reef has been smashed. They're eating all of this ultra-processed food because they are lacking a traditional diet. They then have these very high rates of cardiovascular disease. I'm not trying to say that this is a perfect causal mechanism of exactly what is happening, but I think it is reflective of broader patterns of what is happening globally to our food systems, where traditional food systems are dissolving and degrading because of environmental resource degradation. And supplanting them is kind of all these market globalized products that are often flooding markets with cheaply accessible ultra-processed foods. And I think speaking this in an audience in the Pacific is probably no clearer example of where these things are happening. So it's a bit more kind of far field if you think about these things. Yes. Next slide, please. So in terms of kind of the non-large global studies that I'm doing, we're really kind of rooted in the ground and thinking about some of these things. We ran a 3-year prospective cohort study in northeastern Madagascar. We worked in 5 different villages with 3 different governance types: a marine national park, traditionally managed areas, and 2 locally managed marine areas. And we collected data on weekly fish catch, dietary intake, and then we also took clinical health measures where we were collecting blood samples, fecal samples, breast milk samples, fingernails, and that was to look at kind of pathogen profiles, inflammation status, nutrient profiles across a broad suite of nutrients, everything from vitamin A, vitamin B12, iron, zinc, fatty acid profiles, malaria status, microbiome, like everything that you could think of that might be important to look at to understand these dynamics between dietary intake, interrelationships with disease, and ultimately nutritional outcomes. And the idea was, can we actually create connections between how fisheries are managed, people's access to seafood, and people's nutritional status? And so the results are still kind of up in the air right now. Laura, who's sitting in the front row, might be kind of taking this on as an analytical project, and so she can keep us all posted if she ends up wanting to work on this. But we have this really, really neat data set that allows for us to look at this across low fish catch and high fish catch seasons in this bay. We also have a project in southwestern Madagascar, which is a completely different ecosystem. So the northeast is kind of beautiful mid-altitude to lowland rainforest, coral reefs, but very much kind of a mixed agriculture and fishing culture. In the southwest, you have the coastal people who are entirely fishers and basically do zero farming. And then inland people who are doing farming, but very, very poorly because the environment is terrible for it. So you can see here these IPC characteristics of where there is what has been touted as the first entirely climate-driven famine in human history. And so this is not something that is driven by political, social, or economic factors. it is driven by the fact that there has been recurrent droughts in this area that has led to total food system failures in the region. And so very, very challenging food system dynamics here. And what we're doing is actually developing an artificial coral reef intervention off the coast of this area. Next slide. To see if we can actually look at this process of developing an artificial coral reef, rehabilitating fish stocks in this area to determine how increased access to seafood might actually be able to nourish people in the context of this climate-driven thing. Next slide, please. So we have around 27 kilometers of coastline, 13 villages that have been enrolled all along the Bay of Rambouillet. Again, it's fish dominant here, but we do have 4 controls in the areas that are strictly agriculturalist, widespread malnourishment, reefs that have been in decline, but primarily not in decline from climate-related reasons. They've been in decline from disruptive fishing practices, primarily industrial fishing that have been allowed in. The communities have decided to use both kind of marine protected area options and also to build these artificial coral reefs with us. By the time that we're done, it will actually be the largest artificial coral reef in the world. So it's a really exciting intervention where we're trying to design it in such a way of kind of a before and after control intervention design. It was going to actually look at impacts across ecology, socioeconomics, and human health. So the idea is that we set up these arms, they recruit biodiversity, we then transplant them and seed new reef habitat with these kind of limestone skeleton structures and try to monitor the impacts that that has by carrying the microbiome of adjacent healthy reefs into areas that no longer have healthy reefs. And by extending this over time, the hope is to rebuild these reefs and determine whether or not there are ecological and social impacts to their development. So this is a very, very large team. I won't be able to name everyone, but it's a collaboration between EHSN, which is the Marine Sciences Institute in Madagascar. They are our primary partner, also Reef Doctor, which is a UK-based organization that has been helping us actually implement the artificial reefs. And then a colleague of mine, Aaron Putman, who is based at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, who does a lot of the ecology, eDNA, and reef-based work. And my team, including Aru, Heather Callahan, Jessica Zambrano-Nason, and Chris Nicholas, and Hervé Randirmad, are all working on the kind of social, economic, and human health dynamics that we love. So this is really getting at this pattern. So as coral reefs decline in the context of a traditional economy, undernourishment would arise. So how do we then reverse that? Is there a way to go from this to this and get people back onto this track? Next slide. And so now we're going to think about this other pathway of what gets us to the accelerating nutrition transition. And so broadly, I'm sure folks kind of know about the nutrition transition, but in moving from least developed countries to developed countries, that process of development has many kind of coinciding factors with it. There are epidemiological transitions, food transitions, environmental health transitions. One of the most important is the nutrition transition, whereby you move from a more traditional diet with lots of whole foods, broad diversity, lots of fruits and veg, and whole grains. You move into ultra-processed foods, high in meats, lots of energy-dense, sugar-dense foods that then come into coordination with a variety of other adverse nutritionally related disease outcomes. Of the 10 most obese nations on Earth, 9 of them are small island developing states in the Pacific. So this topic is really no more important anywhere else in the world than here. So we were working in Kiribati, where the population, it says it's 46%, but it's not been updated to our most recent results, which show that it's around 49% of the population is currently obese. And so many of these countries are kind of facing the outcome of these perversions to their traditional food systems that have led them on a trajectory to adverse health. And so this paper that we recently published, I thought that it had 2 really exciting messages. One is that if we think about an increase in aquatic animal source food consumption, then that could help to fill a lot of these micronutrient, vitamin, and fatty acid gaps in countries that need it most. And so if you see these areas that are having the brightest purple, many of these areas are ones that you saw before, these kind of equatorial regions that needed that bigger boost. And so that's a more kind of direct filling of what we call the micronutrient gap. The more unexpected result was that if we force into our modeling system an increase in aquatic animal source food consumption, we saw correlated decreases in red meat consumption, poultry consumption, egg consumption, and in some locations, dairy consumption. And then this was the overall consumption patterns. And so what you see is that by necessity, and as it should, Africa, sub-Saharan Africa specifically, continued to have increases in its non-aquatic animal source food consumption. So things like red meat, pork, poultry, et cetera, continued to increase in sub-Saharan Africa, where it didn't increase in almost every other part of the world in the context of increased aquatic animal source food consumption. So both of those increased over time in our modeling scenario. Whereas in every other part of the world, as fish consumption increased and became more available, it led to decreases across the board for all of these other products. And all of those other products are the ones that are most highly connected to different types of colorectal cancers, reproductive cancers, diabetes, heart disease, et cetera. And so it really is kind of a win-win both for the global north and the global south for models of increasing people's access to seafood. However, the amount of seafood production that was required in our models could only be achieved through aquaculture. And so I'm going to kind of finish off this presentation talking to you about some of the hope and potential, but also a lot of the shortfalls of where aquaculture stands right now. Right. And so here are the trends in global seafood consumption, and you can see that this is largely geographically inequitable in terms of where these kind of major increases are happening. You can see a lot of North America, East Asia, Australia, certain countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but for a large part, all of this kind of global average increase in consumption is not necessarily hitting the food that we want it to hit. And we produced a paper, again, you're going to get tired of me saying typology, but we created 3 different typologies of how the 40 most nutritionally vulnerable countries on Earth acted with respect to aquaculture production and whether or not that might have any sort of nutritional bearing on their societies. So the countries in red produce little to no aquaculture. And because of the way that global trade dynamics work, the global trade is not going to pull aquaculture products from other parts of the world and send it to Libya, Yemen, Western Mauritania, Mozambique. That's just not the way that our trade system works. It's driven by a lot of different factors, primarily financial capital, that's going to pull these sorts of fish products primarily to other countries that have more stable market system and higher prices to pay. The countries in yellow are actually producing quite a bit of aquaculture, but it's almost entirely export oriented. And so the only way that those countries would benefit nutritionally from aquaculture production is if these large companies that are producing it, then the income kind of trickled down and benefited communities of people who were nutritionally vulnerable. Again, not the most likely scenario in knowing the companies that work in Madagascar, Peru, and Chile, that would have benefits to society at large. And lastly, you have the countries in green, which are the countries that are producing a lot of aquaculture. It's being retained domestically, so that is where it is hopeful. And yet, so in many of those countries, it's being destined to megacities, to wealthier households. And so it really needs to be designed in such a way from the outset where aquaculture production is meant to be kind of gender mainstream, pro-poor, and done in such a way where it's really nutrition sensitive from its outset. And without that, you're really going to struggle to find aquaculture serving that purpose. It's not going to happen through market gravity. So what we see here is that there are countries like Cambodia, like Bangladesh, where there are kind of paired rice fish farming systems where women have been put in charge of a lot of those fishing systems and that nutritional benefits have been observed, but in many other systems, they have not been. So there are kind of bright spots there, but it really needs to be designed that way from the outset. So ultimately, what we want to see is nutritionally sensitive systems of aquaculture management and aquaculture production, and nutritionally sensitive versions of fisheries management that take into consideration both sustainability and human nutrition and well-being that lead to an increase in fish catch, strengthening resilient food systems, leading us into positive dietary change, and ultimately landing us all in nutritional security. So I realize that sounds very, very fluffy at the end, but I do think that the more and more I do data analysis on this, I try to ground it in places where I'm working in the field. I do see this as a very hopeful path forward. I think there's lots of rooms for improvement, especially on the regulatory side and the healthy side of things. But I do see this as a potential path forward to healthy and sustainable diets. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.